We're going to continue our study of Christian evidences tonight. We're calling it the story of reality because we're looking at Christianity as a worldview, more than that, as a story that best describes the world around us. We are going to be comparing it with other worldviews and asking, and this is something we're going to do a lot tonight, do the alternate worldviews provide us a better explanation of the world around us than Christianity? How does Christianity hold up to it? And our task is, tonight we're talking about the problem of evil, but our task is set out for us in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, which tells us to, in our hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense. That's a rational explanation to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. And we're to do that, he says, with gentleness and respect. So that's why we're spending time this quarter on Christian evidences. But you've had classes like this, and you've been to workshops, and you've been gospel meetings that emphasize Christian evidences. So I wanted to try to do it in the framework of the Christian story or worldview and ask, when we hold this up to reality, how does it compare? And of course, my position is that it is a perfect explanation for the world around us. Now here's where our story begins, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And there's a lot in that first statement, especially regarding the main character of the story, God. We need to understand who that verse is talking about. So we have to stop right after the very first line and analyze that and realize this main character is a person, not a thing, not an impersonal force behind the universe. He is the central character. This story it involves us, but it's not about us. It's about Him. Everything belongs to Him because He is the Creator. We may manage things for Him, but all of the things we have are blessings from Him. We didn't create it, so it's not ours. And also, and this will be very important tonight, He is distinct from His material creation. God Himself was not created. According to this story, He just is. He is eternal. He always was, He always is, He always will be. And the creation that He made is material, and everything in it has been made. And so that's where we ended after the first lesson. Now, last week, Tim came in to compare the beginning of the story and the main character of the story with the world around us. Does the world around us seem to mesh well with Genesis chapter 1, verse 1? And Tim did a great job. That was not an easy assignment that I gave to him. I appreciate him stepping in and doing that. And I told him after he was finished, I have a new favorite animal. The cuttlefish is now my favorite animal. I watched videos of the cuttlefish online. I'm telling you what, that is a very interesting creature and an indication of design in the universe. So he talked about two questions. The question of the cosmological argument, which is, why is there something instead of nothing? You know, things don't come from nothing. Every effect must have a sufficient cause. And hopefully you were able to at least get from that the law of cause and effect suggests that Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 is an accurate description of reality. Secondly, he talked about the teleological argument, or the argument from design, which asks, why is there design if there's no designer? You know, the cuttlefish is able to do things, and it's amazing to look at. How could you say that accidentally happened? You can stack billions upon billions of years, and it still is not logical to conclude that the cuttlefish just happened. That's a story that would be a very hard sell if people weren't trying so hard to avoid the true story, the Christian story, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And so I hope you can see what we're doing. We're telling the story, and we're pausing to ask, how does this story compare? How does it hold up? Now, before we go any further in the story, we need to address an objection to this creator narrative, an objection to the idea that there is a God who is the first cause, who is a person, not a thing, the central character. Everything belongs to him. Because in this story, this God is also said to be omnipotent, and he is said to be good. And that introduces to us a problem that skeptics lodge against the Christian story, and is called the problem of evil. And there are a lot of ways to state it. One of the earliest statements of it is by Epicurus. You see his dates there, 341 to 270 BC. Epicurus is the father of Epicureanism. You read about the Epicureans in Acts chapter 17. Paul encountered them. They, with the Stoics, gathered in Athens to listen to anybody who had a new teaching. And they spent their days just talking about philosophy and the latest teachings and wisdom as they saw it. So he was a Greek philosopher before the time of Christ. And even though the Christian story wasn't finished, he was already challenging it, especially this part of it that says there is a good, benevolent creator behind the world. And here's how he challenged it, and you can see in it the basic fundamentals of the problem of evil lodged against the Christian story. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent, not omnipotent, but impotent, meaning powerless. Secondly, he asks, is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent, not good, but malevolent. Is he both able, omnipotent, and willing? He's good. He says, if that's true, that there is a good and benevolent God, then whence evil? In other words, how do you explain evil? Now, another way to put it is either God is too weak to prevent evil, or he is not good and doesn't want to prevent evil, or there is no God. Just in its raw emotional form, the problem of evil asks, if there's a good God in this world, why do people suffer the way that they do? Why is there so much hurt? And you can understand where that comes from, and you can see it's a very powerful argument, and maybe as a Christian, you're intimidated by that argument. And so tonight, we're going to attack it, and we're going to weigh it against the Christian story and against alternative views, and ask, what is the best explanation for reality, for this world that does involve evil? Okay, so I'm going to start with the alternatives. And there are two basic alternative stories to the Christian story that are proposed, and I think they encompass everything as far as relates to the problem of evil. And we're going to call the first one matterism. I get these terms. I'm going to talk about matterism and mindism, and they come from Gregory Kokel's book, The Story of Reality, which gave me the idea for this class. Matterism is the idea that matter is all that exists. More familiar terms to you about this is materialism or naturalism. And it's just the idea that there's no spiritual realm, no heaven, no hell, no angels, no demons, no supernatural, miraculous activity, no God, no spirit realm, just atoms floating around in the universe, bumping into one another. That's all there is. Nothing beyond this world, no life after death. That's matterism. And this is the story that atheists, skeptics, humanists, all of them believe. It's the story that a lot of people in our world who say they believe It's the story that they act like they believe. In other words, there are a lot of practical atheists out there. If you ask them, they'll say, yeah, I believe in God. I think the number's like 74% of Americans still profess belief in God, but do 74% of Americans act like they believe in God? That's a different question. And so this is really maybe the predominant story of our age. If you include the practical atheists, people live as if this world, the world that we can see and touch and hear, this world is all that there is. So where does that leave us? If matterism is true, what is the result of that? Let me share with you a few proponents of matterism and look at the consequences of it. This is George Gaylord Simpson in a book about evolution. He said, "It is already evident that all the objective phenomena of the history of life can be explained by purely naturalistic or materialistic factors. Therefore, mankind is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind." Doesn't that just fill you with good vibes? That's matterism. Okay, look at this one. Richard Dawkins is always good for a pick-me-up, so here's a quote from Richard Dawkins. "In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt and other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." Dark, right? But that is an honest, rational conclusion drawn from matterism. Now, this next quote is not attributed to an unbeliever. Dennis Prager, I believe, is a Jewish person who believes in God, but he's describing matterism as nature has only one commandment, not 10, eat or be eaten. Might makes right. If you're powerful enough to do it, then you can do it. That's the idea of matterism. Now, how does that hold up with the existence of evil in the world? Well, at first it sounds like maybe it's the right story, until you get to the question of where do you get the concept of evil? Where does that come from? I mean, how, in the Richard Dawkins, let me go back to Richard Dawkins. In this quote, he mentions justice. And he seems very angry that there's no justice in the world today. Where does he get this idea of justice? How do we talk about evil when there's no objective standard to determine what's good and what's evil? How do we evaluate the behavior of people? How do we think about things as they should be? Now, someone may say, well, I can come up with my own individual purpose, and I guess that's true. You can come up with what you think is right and wrong. But when we look at this globally, universally, there will be as many ethical standards as there are people in the world. And that's not the kind of thing we're looking for here. Because generally agreed, there are moral standards in the world today that most of us agree on. And so that's the big problem with matterism. There's no objective standard by which to determine evil or good or justice or injustice. And there's no way for us to say that a social worker is better than a human trafficker, which we would all agree, I hope, is true. But where do we get that concept? And so it's matterism that has a problem when it comes to evil, because it can't even explain what evil is. Okay, let's go to the second alternative story to the Christian story as we evaluate the problem of evil. And we'll call this mindism. And matterism says matter is all that exists. Mindism says mind is all that exists. Now you remember the Christian story says mind created matter. God is distinct from creation. God is spirit, creation is material. But you see, these are separated in the alternative theories. It's all one way or the other. Mindism says mind is all that exists. And when it talks about mind, you need to understand mindism is not about a personal God, but rather just this impersonal force or the absolute that permeates everything. It says that God is in everything, in every person, in every animal, in every plant. It's also known as pantheism. That's two Greek terms, pan meaning all, theism having to do with God. It's the idea that God is in all things. So here's what it involves. It requires a little more explanation than matterism. Number one, everything is God, including you and me. Nobody is better than another person because we are all equally God. Number two, we have forgotten we are God because of something called Maya, which is basically illusion. This idea that you're a distinct person in yourself, distinct from other people, distinct from the animals, distinct from plants, distinct from the world, that's an illusion. You're mistaken. And the world is full of these illusions that tell us this thing. And we find our way back by choosing among many routes to enlightenment. There are all kinds of different ways that you can find enlightenment and realize that this distinctiveness between people is an illusion. That's where yoga comes from. Now people do yoga as exercise, but yoga started in India as a path to enlightenment. And there are many other possible paths to enlightenment according to mindism. But the goal is enlightenment or moksha, which is the liberation of self. They call self the Atman, and they call the absolute of all there is the Brahman. And so your goal is to liberate your spirit. I don't even think they would use that, but to liberate your spirit from the individual self and be released into nothingness, into the absolute, all there is, this impersonal force. Now, you can't do this overnight. It takes many lifetimes to reach enlightenment, according to mindism. And this is where reincarnation comes from. Your karma determines the next life that you come into. So karma is the consequences of the behavior in your last life. So if you're a really good person, maybe you come back as a rich person, a noble that has time for meditation and working towards enlightenment. If you're a bad person, maybe you'll come back in the next life as a cockroach. And you just keep working your way through these lives until you are finally liberated and released into the absolute. And it's a very foreign idea to us, but this concept is very popular in other parts of the world, particularly in the East. It takes two slightly different paths after those things. One may be familiar to you, maybe not. But the first path is Hinduism, which is a very large world religion. And Hinduism says there is no self, there is only God. The idea of an individual person, of you as you, that's just that Maya illusion. It's not true. And our job on earth is to work ourselves out of that idea. The second and more popular in the West form of this is New Age. This idea is popular because it focuses on the self. And it's all about promoting yourself and feeling good about yourself. And it's the idea that the individual is not nothing, but he is everything. So you're a God. That's the idea. And so you can't be wrong in anything that you choose. And one of the things that makes this very popular is the idea that you can chase enlightenment through many different paths. They might say you can try to find enlightenment through Christianity. You can try to find enlightenment through other world religions. They're regarded as not very judgmental. But anytime you start down a path or you choose a story, you're judging all the other stories. So if you subscribe to mindism, you automatically are judging the Christian story, you're judging matterism, because you're saying mind is all there is, and everyone is a God. And Christianity is saying there is only one God, and matterism is saying there is no God. You see? But it's very popular because it's looked upon as tolerant. Now, how does mindism hold up to the problem of evil? Well, mindism makes the problem of evil impossible, because it, like all other distinctive things, is just an illusion. And mindism says everyone is God, therefore no one can be wrong, everything is right in life, and how can you have evil if everything is as it should be? So it's not a good explanation for what we all know to be true, which is we live in a broken world, full of problems, full of suffering, full of evil. So let's consider the Christian story. Not only does the Christian story have less trouble than matterism or mindism, the Christian story explains the problem of evil. And it's the only story that can explain why it exists. So let's look at it. Noticing, first of all, the problem of evil does not question God's omnipotence. You remember the way it's stated is, if God is all-powerful, then He would stop suffering. Well, this Christian story says, not necessarily, it depends on what you mean by all-powerful. Okay, so omnipotence does mean all-powerful, but to get more technical, it has to do with power. It has to do with being able to do things that power can do. It doesn't include contradictions. It doesn't include nonsense. It doesn't mean that God, for example, could make a square circle. Or, I've heard people say, if God is all-powerful, can He make a rock so big you can't lift it? No, that's not what omnipotence says, because those are contradictions, and it's not about nonsense. It's about logic and what power can do. Anything that power can do, God can do. And so that's omnipotence. It's not, the problem of evil doesn't question that, because it's not saying God is unable to do things. Secondly, the problem of evil does not question God's goodness. Skeptics argue that if God were good, He'd want to do something about suffering, but sometimes good allows something bad, even when it could be prevented. In other words, God may have a reason for allowing evil in the world. And so His goodness could be reconciled with the problem of suffering. Now, here's a couple of thoughts under that. Number one, God might allow an evil in the world because it will prevent a greater evil. Let me give you an illustration. Let's say a soldier during World War II is dropped behind the battle lines and disguised as a German officer, and his mission is to destroy the gas chambers where so many innocent people are being killed. And so he's in that disguise, undercover, working toward the accomplishment of that mission, when he sees a fellow soldier on his side about to be executed. And he's in a position where he could stop the execution. But if he does it, he'll blow his cover. Now, is there a good reason for him to not stop that execution? Yes. If he overlooked that, he would be allowing that suffering in order to prevent a greater evil, which is the gassing of thousands of people. So that's an illustration of what we're talking about. There are cases where you allow a lesser evil in order to prevent a greater evil. And here's another side of that. God might allow evil because it will produce a greater good. Now, any of you who have raised children know about this one, because you've had to take your kids in for vaccinations, right? What a miserable thing to have to do. You take this kid in before he or she can talk, and they've got to get jabbed by a needle, and it hurts. And you can't really explain to them why you're hurting them. Man, Ava would become superhuman in strength whenever we would lay her down on the table. We'd have to pin her down, and she would scream, and why are you doing this to me? And get away from me. And we would force it, and it would hurt, and she'd be terrified. But we did it for a greater good, which is her health. And long term, it was better for her. That was allowing suffering in order to produce a greater good. So you see, goodness does not always avoid suffering. Whenever you discipline your children, what are you doing? You're trying to allow suffering to produce a greater good. So parents know this very well. Sometimes God might allow an evil because it will prevent a greater evil, and sometimes God will allow suffering because it might produce a greater good. Now, with that said, is there any good great enough to justify God allowing evil into the world? Well, let's think about that. Here's a difficult question. Why did God create us? Now, somebody might say, well, God created us because He wanted someone to love. But that's not correct. Because 1 John 4:8 says God is love, making love an essential attribute of God. There's no such thing as God without love. God is love. So before we were ever created, God was love. How? Well, you remember God's nature is that He's three persons in one essence: Father, Son, and Spirit. And so within the Godhead, love was able to exist as they interacted. If you have a problem with that, you can go to John 17:24 and look at what Jesus said in this prayer to the Father. He says, John 17:24, Father, I desire that they also whom you have given me may be with me where I am, to see my glory that you've given me, because you loved me before the foundation of the world. You know, John began this letter saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word is Jesus. He was with God in the beginning, and he says here, before the foundation of the world, you loved me. So there was love, there was interaction within the Godhead between the Father, Son, and Spirit. So He didn't create us just to have someone to love, but He created us for some other reason. And the best thing that we can think of is that God created humanity to share friendship, to share love, and to share happiness with more people, with us. He wanted to share these things that He already had within Himself. Now, what kind of beings are capable of friendship and happiness and love? They have to have free will, right? A rock can't do that. A plant can't do that. Animals, to some extent, animals have a will, and to some extent they can love, but not to the extent that God can, right? We were created in God's image. Now, this is another part of the Christian story. You have to get a little further than Genesis 1, verse 1. But as we read on down, we learn that God created us in His image, verses 26 and 27. That means He created us with self-awareness. He created us with a moral sense about us. He created beings capable of happiness and sadness, of love and hate, and He created us with freedom to choose our own way. Love doesn't exist in a setting where someone is forced to go with another. That's slavery, or robotics, or instinct. But love is a choice by definition. So the only beings that are capable of sharing friendship and love and happiness with God are human beings. That introduces a problem. If God's going to share His friendship and His happiness and His love with free moral agents, what necessarily has to be possible? 3-letter word. Sin. I heard somebody say it. Sin. We can choose to do right, or we can choose to do wrong, right? That's the only way God can have friendship with us, is if we can choose mutually to be friends with Him or not. So He created us, and we had that potential in us. And that's how evil comes into the world. Now, is that worth it? Was it worth the risk? That's what somebody may say. I've heard people say, why didn't God create a world where that was impossible? Wouldn't a world full of automatons, of just robots, be better than this world? And there's no way for us to know that, because such a world doesn't exist. You can hypothetically talk about that, but you don't know that. And whenever we're dealing with questions like this is an important point when we're talking about Christian evidences. It's not necessary for us to give the right explanation. It's just necessary for us to show there are possible explanations. And there are other possible explanations for the existence of evil in the world. This is just one of them. I think it's a biblical explanation. But once we show there's at least one possible explanation, then we've proven that there's no necessary contradiction between the existence of the biblical God and the problem of evil. Now, getting back to, was it worth the risk? It's too complicated, really, for any of us to truly understand how God can be good and use sufferings for a greater good. But we've seen it happen. Let's go to Genesis chapter 50. You'll recognize this as the story of Joseph. Think about all that Joseph went through. Things started out well. He was the favorite son of his father, received the coat of many colors, and his brothers hated him. For one thing, he was always telling him his dreams. And that's annoying in itself, right? You don't want to hear somebody's nonsense dream. But the other problem with the dreams is the meaning of them was pretty evident. And they were that, all the brothers and the mother and father were going to bow down to Joseph. And they also hated him because he was the favorite. He didn't work out in the fields like they did. He got special privileges they didn't receive, so they sold him into slavery. And he wound up in the house of Potiphar. And then he was unfairly accused by Potiphar's wife. And he was just trying to do what was right. And he got thrown into prison for that. And then he was forgotten in prison. He helped some fellow prisoners out. A cupbearer and a baker interpreted their dreams. The dreams came true. The cupbearer lived through that and said, I'll remember you to the king, but he forgot him for 2 years, I think. But finally, Joseph received his reward. He was lifted up second only to Pharaoh in Egypt and was able to save his family from famine and brought them into Egypt. It took a whole lifetime for Joseph to see what God was working out through all that suffering and see that he was a part of a greater good. Now, God was allowing suffering to prevent a greater evil and to produce a greater good in the story of Joseph. But in the midst of all these things, all Joseph could do was just trust that this God was who he said he was. And he did. And at the end of his life, after his father's passed away, his brothers are afraid that he's going to take vengeance out on them. And this is what he says in this classic statement, Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. He says, after telling him not to fear, he says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Now, what is the word it? What's the antecedent of the word it? The evil, right. You meant evil, but God meant this evil for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive. Not just me, but many people, you, my brothers, and this whole nation God is building through us, as they are today, he says. "So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. And all I'm saying here is that we can lay this out logically, but emotionally this can be a difficulty for us. Okay, sure, for some people God works things out for good, but in my situation I just can't see it. And that's where you need faith. And faith is not unique to the Christian story. I mean, you need faith to believe that everything is matter, right? Because there are just things in the world that can't be explained by that. You can't even explain the problem of evil. You can't understand why you have this sense of injustice if all we are just atoms bumping together. It takes a lot of faith to believe in mindism, that we're reborn one incarnation after another, from a cockroach to a horse to a person back to a cockroach again. It takes a lot of faith to believe in that. And that doesn't hold up to the problem of evil either. The Christian story explains it. First of all, it tells us good and evil have a standard. That standard is God, who created the world. And we're disturbed because we're made in His image. And He didn't want this world to be full of evil, but He wanted to share His friendship with His created beings. And we didn't follow His will. We chose our own way, bringing sin into the world. And that's why the world looks the way that it does. So you see how the Christian story holds up so well to this problem? Well, that's where I'll end it here. Does anybody want to add to what I've said, or you have a question or anything as we end class?
That's why the tree was in the garden.
That's why the tree was there.
That was the choice.
Right. It was a test of fidelity to God. And of course we failed that test.
But He didn't want us to just be puppets on the string.
Yeah.
He wanted us to have that free choice.
If we're puppets, we can't show love. But by putting that tree in there, we were able to show love. And unfortunately, Adam and Eve did not show it to the fullest extent, we can say. Anything else? All right. Well, that's all we got for tonight. Thank you for your attention.